Okay, so the essay I chose was The Nature and Significance of Economic Science by Lionel Robbins. So again, I'm going to sort of just sketch out the main points of his arguments, and it's not me like teaching you guys. This is supposed to be a discussion group, and I'm just supposed to be a facilitator or whoever's speaking on a given day. So at any point, just stop, jump in, start talking. We don't have to get through all the slides, right? It's the same format as what Paul went through last week. Okay, so I thought this was a really good essay in the sense that it sort of lays out how we think about economics today, right? Like he literally defines, when you take Econ 101, the definition of economics that you get is defined in this essay, right? And that definition and what that lets us think about as economic problems to understand as opposed to for other people to think about might be problematic or might leave us from studying interesting questions. So that's something for us to think about. But in general, so what does this essay do? It defines the subject matter of economics, right? What are economic problems? What should economists be studying? How do we go about doing it? What's the right way of doing it? And in the process, he defends it against a bunch of other people. Why do we believe economic propositions? Like when we make claims in any economic subfield, why do we trust these claims? What is the role of empirics? Why do we care about the subject anyways? Right? Why is it useful? He doesn't spend a lot of time discussing any one of these, but I think he sort of makes arguments that we still hear, right? Like if you take out some of the data terms and change the names, this could be like an article written by any mainstream economist today. All right. What is economic theory about? So any basically it's a study of choice under scarcity, right? So people want multiple things. They can rank their preferences over these things. They have limited resources which could be used to satisfy any number of these things, right? So they have to face actual choices, and their resources are limited in some sense. And then we can try to use this to explain observed outcomes. Right, now if you compare this to Mill's definition, it's a lot broader. Did you guys read? You did obviously, but did you guys read much of this? Right, so his is much more limited, right? It's the pursuit of wealth. This one is much broader. You're talking about now the economics of marriage, discrimination, sumo wrestling, whatever you want, right? So if you think of it, utility, maximize the utility from wealth versus maximize the utility of whatever, as long as they satisfy these properties, right? And Veblen basically argues that this definition is interesting in and of itself, but it leaves out what most people would consider are important economic questions, right? So it takes the background that we're sort of acting in response to as given, right? So when you think of development and you compare across countries, you see that institutions are very different, right? This is taking those institutions as given, right? But we might want to ask, how do those institutions evolve? At any point, feel free to jump in. I was assuming that people would take offense to a lot of these things, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think it's so much the question of background as much. I mean, the broad point is right, but the point is that what you consider your choices are. It's not. I mean, it's almost a kind of state of nature kind of argument where there's a person trading nuts and berries, right? But the point is that it's not just what the person thinks or their preferences are formed by institutions, some kind of advertising argument, right. But it's that the choices are presented to them institutionally, right? When in the sense that when we live sort of controlled in we live sort of arbitrating between different multiple bureaucracies, and the choices that are presented to us are not the result of some kind of kind of God-given process of scarcity, not always anyways.
Right.
They're sort of mediated by institutional processes, what a particular bureaucracy has taken a choice as to how it's going to optimize its resources and stuff like that. So I guess I'm just adding on to what you said, but it's just important.
That's a valid point.
Yeah.
So do you have any suggestion about what we should disagree on or discuss about?
I don't know, like all of you guys have strong opinions on economics, and I'm giving you the traditional definition.
Is it? Oh, is it? Oh, yeah. But I think
Right.
it's like 3 slides in, so
Yeah.
maybe it's.
So just, yeah.
The point of that thing, how do the background conditions change? That like point just went completely over. I don't understand what you're trying to say.
Yeah, so
Maybe
you
just
kind of
repeat
understood
what
what he said, right?
Yeah, I didn't.
So when we solve an economic problem, right,
Uh,
there's a bunch of assumptions that we make about, say, the rules that sort of establish property rights, what things can be traded, what things can't be traded.
Yeah.
There's a long list of things that we just take by assumption, right?
Yeah.
But really what we might want to think about is how are those institutions evolving over time, right? Okay, so if we looked at the world and we didn't know any of this, right, in economic theory, what would be the inherently interesting questions, right? We would see that some countries are very poor, some countries are very rich.
So you're kind of saying like nowadays, a lot of research takes for given what is themselves interesting. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly,
Oh, okay.
right? Like, how did we develop the legal systems that we have, and how do, like, I guess your point was how do those things shape our
I think
choices?
it's more, yeah, I mean, I think that is a nice way to say it in terms of if traditionally we talk about, you know, I guess you talk about, you set up parameters of a problem and you solve it, right?
Yeah.
I guess what would be trying to be said is that what economics tries to do is to solve the problem, move from, let's say, a given set of assumptions to a given set of conclusions. While that's one way of looking at things. Well, another way is to establish a method, is to establish a process for distinguishing between what parameters we adopt, you know, choosing what assumptions we have. And that's as much part of economics as simply moving, say, okay, we have choice under scarcity, we have and so on, we have homothetic preferences and all that stuff. And given that, let's plug in data and let's solve the problem. Rather than that, we could say, how exactly do we set this problem up? And that's 2 different ways of looking at it. Yes. Yeah. That's how I understand it.
So you're just like maybe suggesting that there's topics that we study right now, or that have been studied up until now, they take things as given which are themselves interesting.
Right.
Yeah, definitely.
You were comparing sort of like an axiomatic approach, like it's very theoretical, and the second one would be more maybe empirical, where you look at things and say, how do we know this?
I mean, not quite. It's more about what aspect of the theory you choose to focus on, right? Because you can do a lot of work by saying that, you know, we have these given assumptions, and we'll accept these assumptions as correct, but you can still do a kind of, you can still work at the level of saying, okay, I can still do theoretical work in terms of how to connect these assumptions to a given situation.
Okay.
You're not changing the assumptions, but you're still doing theoretical work, which is non-empirical.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess that's one way, because yeah, it's not so much, it's about, I guess, it's about talking, I mean, it's not about just like contesting the assumptions, right? Because it's very like in any Econ 101 class, right? You know, you ask somebody, you ask anyone, well, people don't behave like that, people aren't rational. But the point is, you don't have to be ad hoc about that. You have to say, maybe we should develop a method for at like meta level, step back and say, actually develop a method for actually deciding what assumptions to pick. So that's, yeah, rather than just saying, oh, well, I like this because I think people are not rational. We need some way to decide.
I was thinking that it has always bugged me that we use assumptions that we know are false experimentally.
Because they work.
Yeah, but the thing is that when we use models with these assumptions, they approximate the reality close enough so that we have something we can work on. Right?
But do they, is the question.
Not always, but in some cases.
In some cases they do.
Just like, One of my supervisors always said it's like Newton mechanics. Like it works most of the time, but if you're going very fast, you need to switch to another model. If you're going very small, you need to switch to another model. But for 99% of the applications, this works. So maybe we can say in economics that even though the assumptions are false, okay, let's say 50% of the time it works. Let's be a bit more conservative. But
Isn't that good?
By keeping working on this. Well,
Isn't that good? Assumption economic models?
I don't know. I remember going to macro seminars where when they could explain 20% of the variation, they were super happy.
Right.
Yeah, so it depends on the field, I guess.
So wouldn't you think that kind of assumption or the background would be a bit biased or dangerous for like Euro or Western countries? Because I study development, and then we discussed a lot about how like the economic thinking today is really Euro or Western central, and then it doesn't apply like that exactly. Like even I think it's way less than the president you mentioned just now to the south, to the global south. So do you think that that would be a bit dangerous when we are living in a globalized world, and then we are still applying this kind of background thinking in the whole like global economic thinking?
See, that's interesting because that's what I was talking about. Because if you look at a lot of sort of development work, theoretical development work, what they're doing is they're saying, well, we have this theoretical framework, but it breaks down in various ways because, let's take an example. The most famous example is imperfect credit markets. There's a lot to talk about imperfect credit markets, you know, and there's obviously extensive discussion in microfinance and literature. And so what you have is, let's say there's an ideal consumer who has a certain amount of, who has a particular time preference and all these sort of conditions. And then you say, given these assumptions, how can we best approximate this to farmers in Africa? But that's not really what we're talking about. I may be caricaturing slightly, but I think this is, and we say, well, because they're poor, and because of certain frictions, discrimination, and so on, interest rates will tend to be higher and stuff like that. But that's not really what we're talking about. You remember what I was talking about applying a certain set of axioms versus changing the axiom.
So it will mean the axiom will be even more violated in some cultural context compared to others.
Is there an example you have in mind that you really hate, that you want to fix?
I think like if we're talking about global south, then it cannot only be talking like economic field. It has a lot to do with policy and trading, especially trading. Like now, the World Bank and IMF are really involved in their trade policy. Real liberalism kind of thinking. So then, say microcredit or like microfinance. A lot of people think that if you invest like a little bit to the household, then they will have, say, the ability to build up their own entrepreneurship, and then the whole, just their living standard would go up. And that actually didn't happen because as soon as they got the credit, they spent it on the necessity they need for daily life, for their next meal, for, I don't know, their kids, not even education, their kids' breakfast or anything. So that didn't help at all, and they used like the credit to pay for their debt, and then their next debt, and that didn't like help their standard of living at all.
This is kind of a key issue because it's almost, nowadays, what you leave out of a model and what you leave into a model can muddy things quite a lot, because literally the sort of when you talk about INET and stuff like that, the reaction of some people that I've talked to is, any exception that you point out to economic theory, say, well, these sets of models don't work. Oh, well, we've got this friction, we solve this problem, and in the end you have sort of, you can basically, by pinpointing a certain problem, you can modify the parameters in a certain way and generate a conclusion which helps to, so in that sense, in the end, it turns out what assumptions to include in terms of with development, we start talking more about the stuff that's outside the model. We keep the models and we say that, let's introduce a political shock or something like that. But then it turns out the discussion of what shocks to include and what boundary conditions to include becomes more interesting than the working out of the model itself. I guess this is the point I think Evelyn was trying to get to.
So when we talk about how does the background condition change, could be like in some other contexts, the axioms we're basing our reasoning on might apply or not apply. It might be like what shocks happen, or
So using your example, actually, okay, so our models predict that they behave differently than we thought they would, right? But the way they behave is perfectly reconcilable with his model of how people make choices, right? Maybe they were really credit constrained and they didn't, they were really desperate, they were below subsistence, and so the best choice for them would be to spend it on food and necessities and not to invest it in any sort of way. That hypothesis can be tested, give them even more money and see what they do next, right? As long as you assume that people can sort of rank things, right? So first you want to feed yourself, but once you have enough money, you want to think about your future income. Do you start investing in project or like additional sources of income? Do you start sending your kids to school? I don't know what the immediate choices in a particular case would be. If that's true, then it's perfectly reconcilable with this theory, right? You just made bad assumptions, right? Which I guess, is that related to your point?
I think it's more. I think though
am I just making a statement that you said like I'm adding in additional frictions and therefore?
Yeah, and I guess see the issue with sort of theoretical discussions is we're sort of pointing at, we're also implicitly pointing at specific models without having the ability to sort of, without saying that, because that's not what the discussion is about. Right? It's very difficult to operate at this level of abstraction. I guess and I guess I would say that those kind of that's not what those four assumptions can be interpreted in different ways, and the apparatus of micro that people operate with I don't think can be reduced to these four assumptions.
Right. You need a whole lot.
Because there's a reason that Pascal Winston Green is this big rather than 2 pages.
So I think it kind of just boils down she's saying the Western assumptions, they might not work in the South, right? That's what you said. But she hasn't specifically defined Western assumptions, so whatever that they mean, we use them, we predict something, they're wrong. It can be either that these Western assumptions, they just won't work no matter what on the South, right? Or it's just like what she said, there's some parameters that you parameterize wrong, but if you reparameterize them right, then they will work. And that's the question.
a parameter could be a whole functional form, right? Not just
Yeah.
But at what point do you decide to, again, this is difficult to discuss in the abstract, but let's say at what point do you make the decision? You can, when we're talking about, let's say, there is a framework that a certain set of assumptions sets out, and at some point when you remove some stuff, the framework collapses. At some point, you move from slight changes to a complete change. And I guess the issue here is how do you distinguish between somewhere where the model just needs to be tweaked or where the model needs to be thrown out? And are we saying that the second case never exists and the first case always exists?
No, I don't think so. I think
I guess that's I'm saying that we don't have to take that extreme position for it to say that it is often difficult to distinguish between these two cases, and there are some boundary cases.
I think what you just asked, that's a very hard question, and some people think there are completely rational, objective ways to do that, but I kind of doubt it in a way.
to do what? A rational way to do what?
To choose whether you abandon the framework, or you just elaborate it, adopt it, adjust it slightly.
I can see, it means we have a base model, sometimes we need just to add some stuff, or sometimes we need to completely throw out
Western assumptions is a basic model.
I can see...
Or we need to get rid of Western assumptions when you're...
I can see cases where we should get rid of a model. So suppose IO, you take a game theory model, you suppose you have a law that's enforced and stuff like that. In some other country, maybe the network is more important. Maybe some countries are more sensitive to marketing. It's not about the game, do I enter the market or not, but more about should I advertise more or less, stuff like that. And you change completely the model, you're basically in the...
So I think definitely there's cases of both. It's just when you talk in general about how do you do this in general, let's just say for economics, I think what you were suggesting is let's try to think of a way to do this methodologically in economics in the most objective and rational way possible.
I guess what I was trying to say is that there is a psychological bias towards the first and the second, for the obvious reason that when you have a framework,
The first is just to tweak the model.
yes,
Okay.
and I think that a cursory look into I don't know, econometric or something like that, I think will bear this out fairly well. For the very simple reason that paradigm shifts in research happen less often than people problem solving within a given framework. I think that's just empirically true.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. It's just,
So I
The
think
simple way to just fix this will be to, instead of coming with our models and try to apply them everywhere, we should know the field we are applying. Like, if we're applying a model for a country, we should maybe live in the country and see how stuff works before trying to just say, oh, this is how people behave and apply the model.
I think that's the point, because the most interesting, you see, one of the reasons I was talking about the stuff that's outside the model becomes more interesting is when often in a field you have sets of papers which the field is kind of floundering, and people introduce 50 different fictions, and you realize that they're trying to get at some kind of political underlying reality or something like that, which is perhaps more explained by different methods.
Yeah.
Right? So
That's
that's what I was saying between the boundary case where it's very clear that the framework you're using is not tenable, and you're tweaking it in all sorts of ways, and you might get a good fit to the data,
Yeah.
but then you had to do all sorts of mental gymnastics. I guess.
To come back to the definition, because we're criticizing how economies behave in general, but with this definition, it's very large. It's large enough to include anything, right?
Pretty much anything.
We didn't say that people have to be rational. We didn't say that.
Rationality can be expressed in a too good framework. We
Yeah,
didn't say.
it could be even. We just need to have preferences, and
We don't even know what.
resources.
Yeah.
Right.
You could even have a qualitative model for
Yep.
that will fit in this.
For sure, yeah.
And I think Ashik is saying there's no problem with that. That's what you're saying, right? Why not expand it further? The subject area of economics. To from taking given institutions, what is the effect on prices, to how do the institutions change over time? That's what you're saying, right?
Right. Well, I was really just sort of trying to summarize what I got out of that. A criticism he made about
One last thing.
Is it Veblen
Yeah.
or Robbins?
So this is Robbins,
Oh, but
right?
the sentence is
And
Veblen.
giving his definition of
Sorry, just one last thing about this is actually not true for macro. But anyways.
Go ahead. Why?
Well, because you're not always at full employment, right? You're not necessarily always facing a supply constraint.
That's not true.
Sure. Yeah.
So you're not always up against the budget constraint. Sometimes you have to figure out how to get to the budget constraint when you have underemployed resources. You're not talking about scarcity.
Any given agent is still optimizing it.
Right. But we can think holistically, right? There's
Right. So I think this is a claim about individual people.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Fair. But it often
he's not making claims about aggregates at this point.
Okay.
Okay, so the way I read his paper, and think back to the 60s, 70s, 80s, right, and think of the kind of models we had, right, and the kinds of propositions that you had then. I think he's basically arguing that we can believe in these propositions because they're mainly coming from a bunch of postulates that we kind of don't really dispute. Like, I think as Remy said, no one's really going to argue about these things very much. Right? We can argue here and there. What if you're completely uncertain about what you're choosing over? But they seem reasonable. Inputs are scarce and they're somewhat substitutable, but not perfectly. That's also very reasonable, right? Uncertainty exists. Everyone understands that. It would be interesting to think about how much of the results that we get in economics is really just driven by this. This is a nice way of setting up the framework in which we do our analysis. But really, it doesn't make any real important predictions, and most of it is coming from here, right? And I think this is sort of what our previous discussion was, right? What if I just change the assumptions? What can I match the data, right? Okay, so why do we believe in economic propositions? It's not because we observed these things were true in the past, because the past doesn't have to be like the future. We can't do controlled experiments, and even though now we try to do experiments, right, we still have to worry about external validity. And I think I've said his argument for why these postulates are fine. Okay, so then he makes a claim that I thought was, I know we kind of all debated this already, right? So our postulates are based on simple and indisputable facts of experience. Okay. And the propositions of economic theory are, like all scientific theory, obviously deductions from a series of postulates. Right? Is the first one true? I don't know.
Is the first one, oh,
The first sentence.
like all scientific theory?
Yeah. So this is something I guess we kind of touched on last time, right? Is economics a science like other sciences?
Right.
Is it?
Probably, well, in that sense, I mean, it's sort of a very bare way to characterize science. He's not talking about experiments. He's not really talking about induction. He's just saying, well, we have set of postulates.
Theory.
No,
Theory.
right. Well, actually, no. Yes, that's not right because we don't just work with abstract deductive models. We have empirical data as well.
I think it's, if you're asking like how do scientists use scientific theory and how do economists use economic theory, the general structure is exactly the same. You have some assumptions, scientists have some assumptions about the world,
Right.
and then you just deduct. Economists have some assumptions about the world, including ourselves, how we work, and then we just deduct.
But that's for hard science mostly, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, natural sciences. That's what
Natural
you're saying,
science,
right?
That's just how the theory, that's how you use a theory. Just,
So then the second part is subsidiary assumptions, right? So this is where all the details about the real world that you think are relevant to the question at hand. This is where you fill in, right? And since I kind of work with imperfect credit markets, there are many, many, many things you can fill in here to get the outcomes you want. You know, it doesn't mean that the exercise you're doing isn't useful because you're learning about what works and what doesn't. That's interesting to economists. And maybe at some point you can empirically test, you know, which constraint is binding, right? Figure out ways of mapping into data. But there's a lot we can do here, right? And then when we go about applying these models to the real world, okay, how do we do it? Economics ultimately makes conditional things, right? So these are ceteris paribus statements that, you know, if these conditions hold, and if nothing else changes except this one thing, this is what we would get. And the role of empirics is just to tell us which state of the world we're in, right? So what are the right assumptions to make? And if our predictions of a given model turns out to be wrong, it doesn't mean that the model was wrong. It was that either something intervened or you just gave us the wrong subsidiary assumptions, right? I'm being a little bit, you know, maybe unfair, but that's kind of the basic arguments, right? So the propositions are always valid because they are derived by deduction.
Right.
As long as you buy our basic postulates, and in a world where these assumptions are true, it would have to be true. Okay, and then again, I think we've touched many of these things. But so defending the scope and robustness of his definition of economics, right? So we have a theory of how people value things, and his argument is that look, it doesn't really depend on what psychologists think, how our minds work, or like the physiology of the brain. You know, Remy, you can take issue with that if you want.
Yeah. When was this written?
1936, I think, 32.
Yeah, right.
Okay, I changed since.
But then if you look at the second postulate, postulates hold everywhere and across time, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah,
Until then.
so this gets to your point, right? Is there like a cultural bias in assuming those postulates? His argument is no. People everywhere, you know, so his example was economic theory, you know, these postulates don't just hold in Victorian England, it holds everywhere and all times because this is just basically how humans behave, right? Unless you want to think that people didn't have preferences at some point or couldn't order their preferences or didn't face scarcity, you know, you have to deal with that, right? Actually, even now people argue about this. There's a paper by,
About which part?
the first part.
Okay.
What's his name? Gall and Essendorfer.
Yeah,
On
2000. Yeah, they talk.
2005.
2000, yeah, they talk about how verification is notoriously, in terms of psychological verification, or in terms of, talking about rationality and stuff like that.
Right.
Is actually not. Is actually not that. Is neither sort of. I kind of took it as it's kind of not either possible or necessary.
Right. So they were responding to, I think, neuroeconomics, where people have argued that we need to take into account what we learn about the structure of the brain and how people deal with risk and all sorts of other things neuroeconomists talk about. And he says that look, these things like the structure of the brain has no bearing on economic questions. Right? We can continue using the framework we do because
But then
for the
limits-
questions we have.
For sure, but then it limits the range of application you can have.
Does it?
Yeah, because if you... Oh, or do you keep agent being rational, or do you get rid of that and just don't use neuroeconomic or behavioral models?
No, you can use behavioral models, right? But
You tweak the utility functions.
yeah,
actually.
you tweak that's what a lot of behavioral models are, right?
Yeah.
You're tweaking the utility functions, right? The behavioral model, the utility function you come up with can still have no correspondence to how the brain actually works or how
Yeah.
the latest neuroeconomic theory says, or neuroscience theory says the brain works, but how the brain work has no relevance to economic problems, right? So this debate that he was having with psychologists at this time, it seems, is still relevant today. Right? They were responding to a
So
framework.
he was afraid to lose his job just because of his job.
To be fair, like both of those guys are behavioralists,
Oh, okay.
right? So this is not like straight, standard economists arguing
Yeah.
with neuroeconomists, right? So this question, like to what extent does an economic theory have to depend on psychology? and
If we come back to the four points at what makes
Yeah.
economic, or you don't need to go
Okay,
back.
we all remember what they are.
I've been reading a paper where the time used to make a choice is an important thing,
Uh-huh.
and if you keep a utility approach, you can't model that, or I don't see how to model it.
Because the process
Time
don't
use
take
is a
place.
thing.
Like they will predict, depending on the number of choice you have, so what the final choice would be that
Yeah.
utility function can do, but they will also say how long would it take for the person to make the choice and how it would change if you change the time constraint. If you try to do that with a utility function, you might have a paper if you are successful,
Yeah.
but I don't think there is something yet doing this.
Because it's static, right?
Yeah, it's static. And it's rational.
Metaphors and
Can't you do
space
it with
for
rational intention?
movements and
Sorry?
Can't you do it with rational intention?
Then you have to budget, you have to budget your effort to get information or to think about things. Then you will have an optimal.
Yeah, I thought rational and attention models depended on the number of things you're sort of potentially learning about, right? As you increase the support.
We're trying to reduce entropy, right? I've just seen one rational and attention model.
I've read okay, my favorites
Okay.
are at the same level.
But I've not seen prediction of how much time you will use. Maybe if you think about the time being the cost,
Uh-huh.
yeah, maybe you could do that.
Yeah. So, I think standard economists would agree that taking into account that we have scarce time when we make these decisions is obviously relevant. Doesn't matter exactly how we do it. Right? I don't know. Okay.
So,
Yeah.
he had a logical argument, right? That for this, I think do you remember what that argument exactly was? I can't remember. I understood it one way, but I think it might
Start me vaguely what.
I think I remember.
Yeah, but
I think was it about why we should accept these assumptions? Is that what is that?
No, it's about why it doesn't depend on psychology.
Right. I think when you're talking about those four assumptions, right? I think one of the ways you could say that you sort of it basically can't be disputed either by history or by psychology is to make the claim that pretty much you have to assume it to talk about economic questions. So no matter what approach you're using, you're making some version of those assumptions. So why don't we have an approach which treats those assumptions in a rational way?
I don't get that last sentence.
Oh, in the sense that, let's say you have a sort of a sociologist talking about economic questions, right? He's using his own idiosyncratic method. Robbins would point out that in his particular qualitative approach, you still have those four assumptions embedded, but he's not being strictly formalistic, and he's not kind of reasoning out of those assumptions. He's just got those there, and he's being kind of ad hoc in the way that he talks about those assumptions. So why don't we as economists, when we're talking about economic questions, use those assumptions and come up with a consistent approach rather than,
Consistent with the data?
consistent with the assumptions, I guess, because that's how, pretty much every micro textbook builds out, right? You have these assumptions there.
If he's saying, like, economics depends on these assumptions, if you want to do economics, you have to take this anyway. Like,
Pretty much everyone will.
Then it just kind of begs the question of why you even need economics in the first place. And then you have to justify it saying, like, oh, it can predict stuff, but not so well in the South, maybe. But
so the way I understood it is like he's acknowledging the possibility that, so one of the things is that obviously preferences aren't observable, right? He's acknowledging the possibility that we can construct theories that are purely based on observables. So he cites some guy's work who sort of like constructed demand curves.
I think it's a math level too with the real preference. Like the first chapter, they talk about how like
the weak
preference and the
preferences from
Right. So no, Maslow just assumes preferences, right? It's building off of.
Yeah, so he talks about like when he talks about real preferences, he says like people try to like just use this to not assume anything about preferences, and then in the end it worked out that it didn't really work out. He has like that sentence.
But reveal preference theory is about we can't actually observe their utility functions, but because of if we map out their choices, we can construct one.
No, but like that's how it is now. But before they just try to assume, like not say anything about utility functions and just use real preference.
No, what I'm saying is ignore preferences altogether. Think of people and everything else is just the same way you think about atoms, right? And
Can you repeat that, please?
so in the natural sciences, we don't assume that things have purposes or preferences, right? We make observations and we build theories around what we observe, right? It seems that economic theory, or maybe all social sciences theory, has this particular feature that purposeful behavior is important, right? His theory obviously has that, right?
How do you define preference?
People,
Your ranking of a particular set of choices, right?
we assume people have preferences, right? Is
it like they are actively ranking, or is it just like the result?
It's like a property, right? It's not really like there's not really a thinking agent in the model. It's like you define a certain set of conditions.
Yeah. Preferences are what they are. We're not saying anything about how they evolve. They exist, and they motivate people, and the outcomes we observe are coming out of that motivation, right? But if you didn't know about these definitions and you wanted to explain what we consider generally economic phenomenon, right? You can just potentially construct a theory based on observables, right? Based on prices and quantities traded and whatever, right? That has nothing to do with human motivation. So I think he's making two arguments. First, the existing theories at that time that sort of did this, ultimately basically what he's arguing is that they really do rely on people's motivations, right? So you can map out a relationship between prices and quantities, but we know that prices today depend on people's expectations of prices tomorrow, right? So we should be taking that into account, and I think that's the point you were making. The other question is, and he doesn't really say it, but given what we know now, are there sort of, and I guess I'll take this to macro, are there enough sort of like invariant relationships between things that we observe for us to construct theories that do not rely on sort of underlying like human preferences and purposeful behavior?
I guess I don't buy the distinction between sort of axiomatic theories and observable theories. It seems to me that there are theories and they have assumptions and they have postulates,
Right.
whether they state them or they don't, and they have a particular way of treating the data. I don't think there's theory-free data. Theory-free data. I mean, in the sense that there's a theory-free approach. Every approach makes assumptions about what kind of data you're treating and so on and so forth. And I guess what Robbins is saying for me is that any economic theory, either implicitly or explicitly, makes these assumptions, and therefore we can't discard them. In terms of, people have preferences. It's impossible to state a theory of markets without assuming that people have preferences.
Right, but ultimately everything's being driven by preferences.
Oh, the
Right.
driven is a separate question.
Right.
Because
Yeah,
driven,
sure.
you have to get,
I wasn't arguing for like theory-free economics, right?
Right.
That's not the way I was interpreting it. So criticism would be everything's being driven by preferences, and preferences are unobservable, right? Which is not true in, say, natural sciences, right? Is it?
Yeah, no, I'm not. It's not so much that I'm trying to answer your question, but I'm not quite sure. Like, are you saying that preferences are kind of, well, preferences. We're not assuming that people have a certain framework of preferences. We're not assuming that preferences drive this price or that price in a specific way. We're assuming it's the form of the theory, right? It's like the formal structure. And we fit matter into that form. We put certain relationships.
Right.
I guess that's why I don't get the whole observables, because you always have a formal structure, and you have the observed data to fit into that structure.
Sure.
So,
Right. Someone could argue that you can construct an alternate theory of economic phenomena that doesn't rely on preferences at all.
Oh, but Robbins would say that.
Robbins would say no, right?
Because even if, I think what he's thinking about is something like the labor theory of value or something like that, where you have
Like an objective theory of value.
yeah, where the prices are determined by costs of production, which are not determined by what so-called subjective preferences, like the growth path of the economy and even business cycles are dependent on conditions that have nothing to do with anybody's preferences. There's kind of this logic working at it. But even there, we're not assuming that people don't have preferences. We're assuming that the way their preferences interact in market conditions because of the way that markets work are ultimately inconsequential. We're still assuming that obviously people optimize, etc., etc. It's just
they just don't matter. So
exactly.
You don't need to, like,
exactly.
if you just
But
wrote
we're
down the
still-
theory, you don't need to include
Exactly, but we're still making the same assumption.
Right, and his argument is that you probably should still include them. Is that
Yeah,
right?
I mean, but then that would be like a normative claim for demand side theory of price and stuff like that. It's like,
Well, okay, fine.
I mean, I guess what he's saying is that everybody, I don't care if you're like in the kookiest corner. I mean, if you're kookiest corner economics, when you're talking about markets or when you're talking about the economy, whether you say it or not, you have those four assumptions at the formal structure, because you can't. Basically, it's impossible to deny them. So therefore, you have to accept them. That's
Right. Were you going to say something?
What is a theory built on just observables?
yeah.
I don't really understand what that means.
I think it would look something like, price rose, quantity decrease. Whenever price rises, quantity decreases, and that's the only statement you make.
Is this a theory?
That would be like an empirical law.
Okay.
Yeah, there's an empirical relation. You have a law between the relationship between prices and quantity, and you go from there.
Right, but I wouldn't really call that a theory.
Well, I mean, obviously you have to include other features as well, right? Today we derived the demand curves from people's preferences in some sense, right? What if you just ignored that step altogether? Or construct a completely different theory, right? Like your example of Marx's theory.
Right.
So ultimately it doesn't really depend on preferences. You can explain Marx's theory without referring to that.
Right. Or realization.
Sure. Yeah.
How would
machine learning techniques that are starting to be used.
I didn't understand the question.
What are how would you put machine learning techniques in that? For instance, like machine learning, you just have initial, like a result, and you have variable to explain that result, and you put it in the computer set with what they call a training set. So with these conditions, we have this result. This condition, we have the result. Like you said this 100 times, and then you put a new set of conditions, and you ask the machine, so what
Yeah, it's
result?
sort of like how Facebook identifies different objects.
Yeah. So you don't even have a model, so you don't have a theory, I guess.
I think you still have a theory. You have a theory that like
machines optimize.
yeah.
You code it, right?
And then if you like start asking more questions, you have a theory about like, well, how do you do machine? You have a training set, and then you have a testing set or whatever, and then you have to have a theory like, oh, the theory is that the one that predicts the best is the best one, and then people would ask like, well, why is that? And then you'd start digging deeper, and then you'd have a theory of machine learning.
But I mean, no, theory of machine learning, I understand. The result, machine learning here is used as a tool, and you get a result from it.
Then
you say, oh, if you give that subsidy to the people, this is how the economy will react. You don't really have equation you can interpret. It's just that you put it on one side of the machine, it's a black box, and then it gives you an output.
But you're assuming that the conditions of the experiment reasonably approximate to the real world, right?
The conditions are observed, or you're using observed variables.
Well, you're assuming that
But
you
you're-
made an assumption then from last semester.
Assuming what?
But you're not actually putting the subsidy in place, right? It's a controlled experiment.
No, it's observed data.
Right, but you're doing something like you're not actually putting the subsidy in place and observing it. You've set up.
So
No,
you're
no,
subsidizing at various levels, and you're observing the outcomes, and you're just treating it as a relationship.
Yeah, you could see that.
Yeah, that's sort of, from what I understand, how like old school came to, like, the applied models used to
Yeah.
be, right?
Okay.
Like the C or the multiplicative.
Yeah. There's some variable that you consume, other constants.
But I wonder what the theory part of this would be.
Well, it was a theory explaining the behavior of macroeconomic aggregates, right? You used it the same way we do with our current theories.
But if you have a theory to explain macroeconomic aggregates, then you have equations, or you have.
Yeah, you have equations.
But
Yeah,
in machine learning context, you
spit
wouldn't
out.
have one. You wouldn't have equations or something.
So it produces.
So, okay, what are you trying to construct a theory of? We already know how machine learning works.
Yeah, I'm wondering, is this a theory, or would there be a theory in this process?
Well, there'd be theory. Well, why are you like? There's so what is the machine? So what's the subsidy example? You're looking at the impact of the subsidy on price. Is that what you're
For
doing?
instance.
For instance, do you have, let's say, when you're setting up the experiment, do you have expectations about what the machine learning tool will get out?
You could have very subjective.
Right.
But you don't, not necessarily.
Right, but that's not. But you have experiment. That's an experimental situation, right? Like that's.
But you have a prediction out of it.
Right, but also there's a reason you're constructing that in the first place, right? You have, let's say, a broader framework in which to put that in. It's not just you.
Not necessarily.
No, but then you know what. But
Your
that's-
theory would be the equation that the machine learning spits out.
There is no equation.
There's no equation. I thought there was an equation at the end that
There's
tells you.
What are they
results.
spitting out? And then you're just.
I thought machine learning like spits out the equation that best predicts whatever the
No.
training set.
That's
No.
if you use machine learning to test models.
Yeah.
But if you just try to do prediction, you don't have equations. You have
Then your theory would be just a prediction.
you have a
It spits out.
gigantic amount of neurons,
Right.
and they will work together that all have small equation in them, but it's so abstract. Like
So what are you trying to rationalize? What are you trying to explain?
Like here we will have a tool that will be able to predict some responses to different action, because you can try different action on the input and see
Responses by what, the machine?
response of the economy. Like let's say price, and the input is subsidies, and you have 5 ways to do subsidies, for
Yeah.
instance. And so you give a training set, the machine
So the economy is populated by this machine.
Populated?
Like, what's the object
What does it
who's
do?
the subject that we're looking at the responses of? The machines?
Repeat this sentence.
Okay, who are we giving the subsidy to?
Isn't it like, okay,
Agents.
Oh, there we go.
isn't it just like Ontario taxed a bunch of people? Now you want to know what will happen in Alberta if they tax a whole bunch of people? You have a data set of Ontarians that like did whatever by tax, and then you divide your whole data set into like a training set and like another set, and then you feed the data, the actual data of actual Ontarians into the machine learning, and then it'll predict for Alberta.
Or even for Ontario if you do different stuff.
Oh yeah, but like,
How
and
is
you're
it-
saying
how is
we're
that different from like policy
simulation.
analysis using a DSG model?
Exactly.
DSG model, you have a model.
Yeah.
In machine learning, you don't have a model.
So,
Okay, so the
in-
model's
in the machine
invented
learning-
by-
So then how is it disciplined? Like you're disciplining it using Ontario data,
You discipline it using the training set,
right?
and you might have a model internally in the machine that you don't see. It's a black box.
So it would be just like economics, how like they say like with these 4 assumptions you can explain anything with these 4 assumptions where it's scarcity or whatever.
Yeah.
Except for your machine learning theory, it'd be just like machine learning can pretty much explain anything if you just feed it a training set.
But
Yeah.
do you have
And that would be the theory.
But like you
Okay.
have, you have institutional conditions, right? You have you. Okay, so
Certainly.
but then
It's just whatever
but
you
then
have
Since
to
you're
say.
not feeding in any Alberta data, what makes you trust the
No, I would look
'Cause
more
like-
at how Ontario will react if you do
Well,
if you have different conditions. in
what
Ontario.
if it's supposed to be? I mean, presumably then
Because
if
machine learning works, that's why you use
but
it.
if
Because Google uses it.
but if there's
because
no
Amazon uses
restrictions,
it.
but if there's no restrictions, how come the model doesn't generate a model where population falls to 0 because there's a random discovery of there are some boundary conditions, right? Because a meteorite.
It's not a
falls-
simulation.
It's not
Machine learning is not a simulation.
Then-
You feed actual data into it, except what you do is if you have like a data set of like 10,000 people,
Right.
you divide your data set.
You can use
And
a
you
whole
don't-
data set. Actually.
What?
You can use a whole data set and then just try to generate new entries, not the
So-
I know, but like I'm just explaining.
There is
so it generates a best guess based on the data you fit.
Exactly.
Right?
That's
So
it.
it's just a statistical model. It relies on statistical theory.
Yeah.
So that's the theory.
So
Yeah.
the theory will be the statistical part.
Yeah, of course.
I don't even know what the theory is behind machine learning.
Well, no one does, but
Okay, and then since you're using it to explain things we would normally think of as like economically relevant questions, that's something that doesn't
But
rely
there
on
would be not
preferences.
economic theory.
but there would be theory on economics.
No, it's a
It
non-preference based, not this kind of theory, but it's still theory about things we would consider part of the economy.
Okay.
Right? So this would be a counter-argument to, like, why are we constructing models based on things you observe and preferences, right? You have to do it.
And if it turned out that like machine learning methods are way better than like the predictions that economics use, then
Yeah.
we would all just use machine learning.
Like, people have been criticizing like ESG models are crap. We should basically just go with like these statistical models.
Yeah.
That's what central banks use anyways. You know, now they use a bit of both, but, you know, it
For
took a long
some
time.
problems, it's better than models. For some others,
Yeah.
I agree with you though. If like your criticism is that like we don't focus enough on prediction, we just like, oh, because these 4 assumptions make sense, like, and because we know like I'm a person, I think about preferences when I choose things, like I know other people are too, so it makes sense that when we're talking about people, like we should have these things in, and that's why we use economics, not because it predicts things better, that it actually does something.
Yeah.
If that's the reason why you're using economics, then that's a wrong reason. But if it's the
But it's actually a common reason, right? If you read the introduction of Lundquist and Sargent, right, they talk about why we need foundations, right?
oh yeah,
But
It's not necessarily because it's more robust. Their argument is that we think this is the way to do it because underlying we believe that we're optimizing.
But I think, like,
Yeah.
they kind of have an implicit assumption that like because underlying this is how the world is,
Yeah.
our theory will be more useful than another theory that doesn't have this assumption.
But you can have people who are kind of more. But anyway, I still
Because
don't.
isn't that like science?
No,
Aren't we just
but-
trying to predict things? What's gonna happen tomorrow? What's gonna
Or
happen?
to understand how it works.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there's a. I mean, I still don't understand.
Sometimes it's to
how
avoid a
machine
prediction to
learning
be
model
realized.
Doesn't have any boundaries.
Sometimes it's to avoid
Surely,
a
like,
prediction to be
there has to be some
realized.
extreme behavior which is not possible. Like
Sometimes science predicts
you're
something and you want to
restricting it
avoid that
study
at
a
all
certain
costs.
market.
Or
You're restricting it to study a certain market.
So it's
not
not
like
Yeah.
model
I think
where
it's
you
more
start
that
the
use,
universe at a certain point that like literally works
Economic
out.
theories that aren't
There are
purely
some-
based on observables, you have
So,
higher explanatory.
Remy, once you start this machine learning model, what's the initial like setup?
There is no.
You have inputs, outputs. You give this to the.
So one input is the data. What's the other input? Like what?
That's all.
Right, but
If this was like a Bayesian model, you need some sort of prior.
Yeah. If it was Bayesian, you would need models. If it's machine learning,
It
you
doesn't
just
have to be an economic model. Like
you
you
have
need some
to-
sort of statistical model,
Yeah.
obviously, right?
It's like you have y, you have x. You're not making linear assumption or whatsoever. You just say y equals f of x
Right.
plus maybe something.
right,
like
but
that.
aren't
And then you're fitting a training set, and the machine will have an f or several f function f's. That when you give a set of x, it will give you the best prediction for y or probabilities of a different possible outcome.
but are there assumptions embedded in the data? Right, you can't just generate any random.
But I'm not using them in any way. I don't know if there are assumptions. If
Well,
they are, they will.
For example, you can't generate, for example, a meteorite, can you, in the machine learning? Can
If you create the variable x as
Right, but that's
right.
but you're embedded. You're putting that in there, right? The point is you're assuming that there are the boundary conditions in the setup of the model.
So you would say that the assumption will be what data you use.
Exactly. I mean, it's not.
Is this
Can
an
you
assumption?
generate Somalian civil war situation within the model?
If you have the data, you
Exact-
have no model.
There you go.
You have no model. No, but it's still there. It's just that it's statistical. If you don't have variation in the variable, it's useless to put it.
Right, but what variables do you choose?
You can put all the variable you have.
No, but that's my. But
That's
you
what
have to
you do.
pick variables, right? You're not gonna.
No, you don't pick
You don't-
variables.
you
You
don't-
just you have a data set. You put all the. I mean, like if you want to do it properly, right? You just
Yeah.
you have a data set. It has like 1,000 variables, 1,000,000 variables. You just all put it in there, and then machine learning will pick out which of the variables that like are
Correlate.
relevant
Okay.
for whatever you want to
But
predict.
even still, in that data set, I mean, it's not like a God computer. It doesn't start with the Big Bang.
My point was more about that this is just based on observables.
Right, but even there, I don't think it is.
It's not just based on observables. You're just putting observed data.
Yeah, but it's not just generate. I mean, it's not. There's a restricted parameter. It's not like starting from the beginning of the universe and moving on to the end. It's, you're saying that we're restricting it to this particular data set, to these relationships in these markets, and it's supposed to find these.
But those
You're-
are all
That's a question of
observables.
interest.
Yeah, is that what you're saying?
But
What?
that would.
Yeah, so even in a model based on preferences, like a DST model, you're still ultimately feeding in data. Otherwise, it's not going to generate
Right,
any.
but you have data plus
A model.
a model, or not. It's not just observables. Whereas in machine learning, you have just observed data.
But you also have the function f.
You don't see it. You don't. You don't.
Someone
have a function.
constructed it, right? Like we're as economists, we're thinking from the perspective of the people who are constructing these things.
But isn't F defined based on the data you have, right? So the theory depends on the data,
Yeah.
not the other way around.
Exactly.
You're not trying to explain that with the theory. You have the data.
No, but you have some background statistical theory.
You still have the machine learning code, right?
Yeah.
Sorry.
The code on your computer that performs the machine learning.
Yes.
That would be like an observable.
And that's not a model. No,
It
it's
is
not.
sort of a model.
It's observed. I can observe the code.
Okay, this is like
Maybe it's not very obvious to me what observable is, and I brought machine learning because depending on the definition you make of observable, here you will just have observables.
But do we come up with a theory out of machine learning? Don't we just come up with like
Yeah.
statistical
I
correlations?
don't know.
No,
I
but is
don't
that-
know how you
So, I
define
mean,
theory.
you can forecast macro variables just by running regressions, right?
Yeah, but then you have, if it's a linear regression, you have a model which is linear.
Sure.
So non-linear regression is non-parametric, fully non-parametric regression. That will yes.
Okay, but suppose I didn't know how linear regressions work, right? And I just plugged in data and clicked the buttons data. I would effectively be in the same situation you are in with your machine learning software.
But you will
Just
be
our
then-
apps are different. Mine is a linear regression and yours is something else. Clearly, there's a code
Yeah, I think-
for
it's
I
more
think
a
even
theory that's
non-parametric.
telling you what's machine
like you don't have a
learning.
specific model, but your machine learning is a model. I think that's what he's saying.
It's a statistical model of some sort.
Machine learning
But
is
it's
a model.
non-parametric,
That's fine. It's,
It's
still
still
a
a
statistical model.
so it's fully flexible. That's what I mean.
Yeah.
Because if you do reg yx on theta,
Yeah.
you're putting a structure in it, on it. A
Okay.
linear structure. You're putting restrictions. Whereas in machine learning, you're not putting restriction. You can if you want, not necessarily.
That's fine, but it's still a model.
I don't know
what you call a model?
It's telling you how to transform the input that you're putting in that function F into outputs.
And the model comes from the data.
Yeah, and you just don't know what
Not
the
the
So
control.
F, it includes lots of little possible submodels, right? It's telling you which one
Technically
fits.
all possible relations.
Okay.
I think like
You're
you're just kind of describing the properties of machine learning, which are great, but like
Yeah.
that
Because
all those
no,
properties
if you were
form a
trying
machine
to
learning
finite
model.
set, like a small finite set of models,
Yeah.
yeah, you will put restriction, which is reality behavior according to one of those models. But if it's fully non-parametric, like fully flexible, then you don't have restrictions anymore. And then it just like comes just from the data and not from data plus restriction from a model.
But then I would
Once again, we'll do a session about machine learning.
No, wait, why did you? What's your point?
What?
What's your
That-
point? With?
It's just to say a theory built on just observables is not possible, and that was just to.
I think one of the
Oh, so I wasn't making a general claim, right? It was more, coming from the field that I work in, are there enough sort of relationships amongst observables that are, stable across space and time that you can just sort of like assume empirical laws and build theories on those, right?
I agree
At
with
least
you.
that
Like
way.
you can make a theory based on observables. You don't have to rely on machine learning. I can just like make
You can just
empirical-
observe stuff.
and just like
Old school Keynesian models, they don't rely on references at all,
yeah.
right? Keynes has stories about, people's beliefs and stuff, but like in terms of the actual ones that they created and implemented.
It's just the C's and
I'm
the
not familiar enough.
But then
yeah.
the theory requires a level of abstraction, right? I mean, even if you say this is what the data produced and these are the relationships you had, you could still say this is only one of many possible worlds, and you could say acting on policy, even though this is what has happened in the past, we can think of new institutions. I don't see how how machine learning would tell you about that.
I think like
don't understand, but
I think a more interesting question is like, should we like in the future, some idealistic future, like have a scientific model that everything we have in the model we can observe? Like I think that's a more interesting question.
yeah.
Well,
And I don't think like that's
But yeah, but anyways, the point was that let's say no matter what the data you have, let's say in the way we're thinking about it in micro or something like that, we can talk about markets as they've historically existed and all the data that we have so far, but it's not strictly true that. So let's say the theories, the price theory and the theory about markets that we have describe a particular ideal situation, and all the data around and it describes basically all the ways that different markets can be out of equilibrium, in equilibrium, welfare is not being optimally maximized and stuff like that. It describes loads of possible states of the world. Now the data we have is the world as it actually is, right? And the point of a theory is that it's sort of, at least the way I think about it, it's sort of supposed to tell you about what are the implications of different possible states of the world rather than how is the way that the world works, I guess is what I'm trying to tell you.
What are repeat the last sentence?
A theory tries to tell you about what are the different properties of different possible states of the world, right? Like let's say if you're in a suboptimal state of welfare, these are the negative properties, but if you were in this other state, then these good things would happen, right? I guess is what theory tries to tell you. But if you're working just from data, you're restricted to defining the way that the world works as it actually is, and you're not abstracting to all possible
You
states.
say it's not a theory.
Yeah, that's why it's not
Yeah,
a theory.
that would work with that sentence.
Yeah, because it's not. I mean, you can.
But then it's just by definition.
No, but of course, but the point is we are arguing. I have reasons for saying this definition is better than the definition which just says it's only about data, because it allows us to identify policy responses. It allows us to talk about the future. It allows us to talk about different possible futures and stuff like that, which machine learning doesn't allow us to do.
Yes, it does.
Not in and of itself, though. You have to have a discussion based on the results you get, and that involves theoretical assumptions and abstractions and stuff like that.
Well, but in machine learning, can't you just like modify
Right, but
one of the variables and see what it
But the
Yeah.
point is we have to have a discussion about what modifications to make, and then you're making theoretical assumptions.
Well, the way you set up your other possible ones that you want to analyze, you just change the variables.
Right, but to discussing about what variables you change, how to change them, and so on. But then even still, like the theory describes all possible states of the world, right? All these possible ways a market could be,
So
rather than the way
it's
markets are.
distribution of y equal f of x. It will be more like p of y.
No, I think it just means well.
Yeah, so any model takes some variable. Okay, so I think the theory pins down what f is, put some restriction on f. It can't be that anything is possible no matter what data you fit in.
It's not quite, I mean, it's not really, it's not necessarily, you have certain structure of the data in terms of what variables you think are important, but you also have whatever positions, whatever data you get about markets, right? I mean, you think about just a simple supply and demand diagram, and you say that we're at this particular point.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, here I'm assuming particular restriction, right? In terms of, we have to assume the market structure. But what the data tell you is just about where you are. But what the theory describes is about all these different places you could be.
Oh, no, so sorry, I agree with that. I was like trying to understand your argument about machine learning, right?
Yeah. It's not an argument, it's a question.
So you're saying that it can possibly predict any potential relationship between x and y,
Yes.
right? But you have rules for how the machine is making those predictions coded in there. Right? And I think that's where the theory part is coming
But
in.
even, I mean,
Okay, so it will be just a statistical theory.
Yeah.
but let's accept, I mean, even if it makes those predictions, right? Let's say, I don't know, what's x? X is the effective, the size of the, size of the financial sector as a percentage of GDP and growth. And it gives you a particular function for how that behaves. But that doesn't really necessarily tell you about all the ways that that could behave.
Right.
Right? But let's say if you have like a theoretical model about how the financial sector works, that it has this intermediation function, it gives you, if you have that theoretical assumption, there's loads of ways you can tweak that abstract model to give you loads of possible ways financial sectors could work, right? You could say that if you have no financial sector, there are all these problems will come up because it plays this intermediation function, people won't be able to do that. It describes loads of possible states of the world, this abstract model that we have.
Yeah.
In terms of what if the financial sector, what if we had, let's say, a different set of financial institutions which played these different functions and stuff like that, and you could describe that within an equilibrium, I guess.
Right. Yeah. Well, I guess you could potentially do it with just a purely statistical model too.
Right, but then again, you're in choosing what to pick, right? You have to have some assumptions about what to pick, what to change.
I feel like you would change the same things though. Like, I don't feel, because if your whole system can be described in terms of variables, then you just change whatever variable you're trying to set up the new world as.
Right, but you're not really. But it works on data. It works on pre-existing data, doesn't it? And in abstract from that, it doesn't just.
Well,
It's
initially you have pre-existing data, and then you can change the data to predict the new setting.
But you don't. I don't understand how you can change the data. The world is how it is, right?
No, because it has predictive
I
policies.
guess
So you're just interpolating or extrapolating.
But anyway, it's just that the sentence theory just built on just observables is not possible. I don't really understand this sentence, and I try to give an example, try to understand it better, but it doesn't work, so I'll just give up.
But there's one more.
Like my only problem was this sentence I don't understand what it means, and I don't think I can.
Oh, I wasn't making. I think that was sort of his.
I don't know what the theory
We
is, and I don't
were-
know what just observable means. So
If I put an economic theory before that word in there, it might become a bit more precise.
my problem is theory. What is a theory? I don't know, and what does built on just observable means? I don't. It could be anything. Built on just observables. I don't know what that means either. So yeah, I'm just lost in this sentence.
Okay.
But don't you, like, let's say you're putting in the data, right? And say, let's get back to the topic of the financial sector. You're assuming that, that you have some, let's say, data set where there are these things called banks, and there are particular variables related to the banks, as base money and stuff like that. What if institutionally you got rid of, let's say, five of those data sets because there's institutional change, and you brought something new in, right? And then you would have to, then there presumably would be a modification of the data set because the old data sets just don't make sense because we've changed the institution, right? And my point is, all these institutional changes have to be exogenous to the machine learning.
I believe that adding in institutions, definitely that is exogenous, but taking out institutions, I think you just take the variables out completely, right, and don't analyze them. But adding in, that's interesting.
Because, let's think about regime change works like this, right? People think that, let's say, in the Soviet Union, if you were born in the Soviet Union and there was nothing outside the Soviet Union for you, you would set particularly your entire frame of reference, all the data that was collected, the categories that you saw the world through, would all be within Gosplan or something like that. And you would say that people interact in this particular way and so on and so on. Again, we're not imposing any theoretical abstraction where, where markets arise as an alternative, because we've come up with a theory of markets. All we use is data, and there's no institutional change, and stuff like that. So we have this category of food production, and you have this aid, and you ask basically in the data, it's assumed that there is a central agency which is coordinating these levels of production. That's an assumption built into the data because that's what these categories are for, right? You think about how much food should be allocated here and here and here, and in some cases, in war situations, you don't have prices at all. So I guess this is what I'm saying about how data sets contain their own assumptions, and what they ignore and what they don't have is as much a product of where you are and and the way you think, and therefore, but comparing that to what I was saying about all possible states of the world, in theory, I guess, microeconomics gives you a way of thinking about loads of different worlds, right? You can think about centrally planned economies, which are, it's an inefficient deviation. But that's not about the data. That's because of this abstract theory of welfare and markets that we've set up. And you can talk about loads of possible worlds with loads of possible different data sets and different assumptions without making any reference to the world as it is. You can talk about, you can say, yeah, I guess that's what I'm trying. That's just what
I think if you're trying to analyze the same areas of study, the theoretical model that's based on far more than observables and assumptions will have a more powerful explanatory power to settings that are not observed. But it seems to me that that's just the scope that's different, and scope doesn't define whether you're a theory or not, right? Because take any that purely observable setting that Remy described in machine learning, you can still deviate from an initial setting, right? It's just that with the theory, with assumptions, your deviation can go much further.
Right.
See, I don't see a difference in terms of quality, but rather simply a difference in terms of
Scope.
Yeah.
But then scope, yeah, I agree. But the point is, scope is really quite important.
Yeah, but they both have scope. It's not like one can't not deviate, whether the other all can.
Yeah.
So you're saying that the black.
So machine learning, I know there's like a method where it just tests
You
like the
turn it
linear
off.
equation of all
Did
different
you turn off the
combinations of variables you can have.
Right.
And it spits out the best linear
That was
equation.
last night.
This is like a machine learning method.
More or less,
Right.
I
So
think
then,
we should stop.
Sure. In the data that you train the machine learning that spit out the linear regression,
Right.
there was an institution. But you can just plug in what if there's no institution.
I
And then you have-
agree. I agree. That's exactly what I was talking about. And the point is, the choices you make there, that's a theoretical choice, and that's where theory comes in.
Yeah.
Because
No, I'm not arguing that. I'm just arguing because you.
I mean, I
It
guess
sounded like you were saying
one
like.
of the reason I'm
machine
kind
learning.
of arguing is because this seems to be some kind of God computer where it's supposed to spit out all states of the world, what everyone is thinking at every point in time, and something like that. And I guess I guess we can get to debate about the causality, right? What if you have it has to be observed? Like
Yeah, that's the
a
only
variation
limitation.
has to be observed. It's that.
Somewhere before for you to be able to do capture all
Yeah.
the variations of the
That's
feature.
why you can't.
That's the only limit of machine learning. But
Yeah.
well, there's no other difference between machine learning and just theories that you use without machine learning.
Well, I would say that the theory doesn't have to do that. And I mean, but the point is that it's not. It has, but then presumably you pick. But observability is a limit, as I've been trying to say. It is. I mean, you can't describe the observed world as only one of all possible states, right?
It's
Unless you have this kind of deterministic assumption that but then we have to get into physics, right? Is can all possible worlds be described? Like, you have this sort of theory of.
Do you want? Okay. I think the rules have limits. Like I said before, it's just the degree of the scope, right? For your machine learning, you're limited just how observable your data have been so far, and then for the limits of series, just how far does your assumption allow you to stretch, and that's just a limit in degrees of scope, and not a limit, the difference in how the scopes themselves are just larger and smaller. They're not qualitatively different.
But what if there's a theory which talks about what's, let's say there's a meta theory, right? That would be a difference in degree, where you're arguing about how to decide what scope to use, and that's a difference in degree because it's a meta theory. You're arguing at a second order level. It's like, well, because then that's.
So you should have to go.
I can start.
I just have a definition of theory here because that helped me a lot. It's so I have several definitions, but one of them, the first one is a supposition or a system of ideas intended to explain something, especially one based on principles independent of the things to be explained. By definition, it's not based on observable if it's a supposition. If otherwise, it will be a description, not a theory, I guess.
I guess machine learning doesn't have explanation or prediction, right? So in that sense, it's not a theory.
Unless, like, if you run counterfactuals, it's more mapping.
But then again, there's an element of choice there, is it not?
No, you can try all possible counterfactuals. Say these are the opposite.
But then again, there's this God computer assumption, right? Where you
You
don't
can
know
write all
it has to be
possible
observed.
counterfactuals.
You have it's a function, it's a mapping, so you can have the whole range, or the whole domain of x's.
Okay.
Like this is you can run it through the machine.
Right, but then observation does function as a constraint. It's not all possible. It's all possible observed.
Variables.
Yes,
That's the point.
Like you have observation, this is just a training set.
Right.
It's not data points, it's the variables that you person.
Yeah.
Right.
But then
So I guess you're saying, like, in a theory you can postulate many different variables, but I guess a counter to that by a machine learning person would be like, we already observed most of the key variables that we need to observe to talk about the sort of economic phenomenon that we want to talk about.
But what if the key variables change for any number of reasons?
Yeah.
You can see.
But then Google is already digitizing everything, so you probably won't have a problem after 5 years.
But then,
But you're describing like a useful prediction.
yeah,
It's not a theory. It doesn't explain anything.
okay, so it's not theory.
Yeah, it would be
Yeah.
like that. No explanatory power,
The other about machine learning, another problem you might encounter with machine learning is that since you have no restriction, it's a lot less, it's more blurry than a model that can pinpoint the prediction. Like it's the same with like any statistics. If you have a model that has a lot of restriction, you'll have very accurate estimates of the parameters. But if you are non-parametric, then you need a lot of observation to be able to make accurate prediction. Otherwise, you will have a prediction that's between these and these that are very wide.
But the difference between prediction and explanation that we were talking, that you pointed out, seems to me to relate to all this other stuff that theories do, right? Because they function as abstract systems of ideas. And all of these different things I was talking about, possible and all that stuff, relates back to that definition. Because all of these different abstract things that they do, which don't depend on the data, what I was trying to say is that we need this at a very basic level. I mean, I don't want to get into too much philosophy here, although I do realize it's a philosophy of economics. In various ways, we operate with theoretical assumptions and ways we do things and rules that we play in which the way that the world is divided up at a very basic level. And that's why I don't think machine learning can, at this very basic level, sort of circumvent the conditions under which it was produced.
So it's not a theory.
No, because it doesn't give you.
That's it. That you see that like, this sentence has been removed. Like,
So I don't think theory needs to explain anything. It just needs to predict well. Is that, like, that's my viewpoint.
Well,
Do
I would
No,
disagree.
it also should
I would
explain.
disagree. Yeah,
Yeah.
and explanation deals with
I guess
Because that's one of the things we want.
yeah,
We care about how things actually work. And
It's not about
Other
something.
relationships.
But like,
When I'm outside and trains, I get, well, is this a theory or is this a description?
It's a description.
it's a description, yeah.
Okay, but it's makes it possible. So this sentence, I disagree with the very fundamental of writing it because
You disagree on the
by
definition.
definition it's not possible. It's not just that it's not possible because of something else.
Yeah.
If you have a theory, it means that you make a supposition that you don't, like it's not observed, so it cannot be based on just observables.
But there's a reason we accept that definition, and that's what we've been arguing about. Is that definition a good definition?
Of theory.
Yes.
But then if we change the definition, it's not theory anymore, it's another word or.
No, but that's how language.
define it.
That's how language works, right? It's like a set of socially accepted
So I
definitions.
need the definition that he used when he wrote the sentence.
And I think it was that one.
Okay, then it's a stupid sentence according to
Fair enough.
Apologies.
Right, but tautologies are important for various reasons, right? Without definitions, you don't.
one. It's like raining when it's dark, it's dark. That's
No, but. in
by
this
definition, yes.
Okay. To make you happy, I think the way that sentence should have been written is what Paul said. You can't have an economic theory without relying on preferences. Without-
Okay, that's very different.
That's his claim. You kind of said that, right? I thought that was your understanding of how you read his argument, his logical argument.
which argument?
When he was talking about these other theories that don't directly refer to preferences, but he sort of points out that underlying them.
I think the point is that like, if you have those references, then you can talk about more interesting things and widen the scope.
Do you need preferences to widen the scope?
Or
No, I thought your claim was any theory widens the scope as opposed to just a forecasting tool. Never mind. Okay, in terms of satisfying your point, yeah, I kind of agree with you. Yeah, it's a tautology as it's written,
Yeah.
but okay, never mind. Do you understand what I was trying to get at?
Yeah, I just like,
Yeah.
I
Fair
spend way too much time on this.
It's fine.
is that the end of the presentation, or is there other slides?
I think we went over, right? Like, how long do we have to
Two
book for?
hours.
We have
Yeah,
to
but
book
we're
for-
There's no rooms booked. There's nothing booked, so and I can stay for like.
Okay.
until
Yeah, I
3,
was worried. I need to run by 3 anyways, but
Where were we? Where did we get up to?
we were basically at the end.
Oh, good.
Phew. Why is economics useful? So he argues his definition of economics is useful. It's because it allows us to deduce non-obvious implications of the choices that we could make. Right? So he gives various policy examples, like what would be the effect of introducing a tariff on some good that you import. It helps us think through like possible combination of policies, sets that we might choose, or economic systems we might implement. And economics should be a positive science, right? It should tell us something about how, if we do A, how the world responds. It's not a normative science.
well, there you can have. I mean, there is a sense in which it's normative where you talk like if we define. I mean, at a very basic level, it does tell us about is-it, right? But that's not really the way it functions in terms of people. Welfare is kind of axiomatically defined as normatively good, right? It's like, I agree that at a basic, like the way the theory is formulated, its formal structure is not normative, but like in
But
terms.
isn't that what he sort of spent a little bit of time arguing? It's
Yeah,
like-
yeah.
So he says that, if I understand this argument correctly, we can assume that people have preferences. We don't have to assume whether they're good or not.
Yeah.
But we can't derive sort of social preferences based on them because we don't know how to add up utility or.
Yeah,
what
it
we're gonna
was
call.
basically it was about that was the I can
Yeah.
get into that. That was the redistribution argument, right? The idea is basically if you have diminishing marginal utility across income, rich people the marginal utility of the dollar for a rich person is less than for a poor person.
Right.
So redistribution is welfare enhancing. Is the argument he's attacking.
Right.
But he says like we don't if there's an ordinal like we're assuming utility is cardinal, directly quantified, but we don't really see this stuff. We haven't really talked about interpersonal comparisons. I guess what he's saying that it's at a very
the little thought experiment that we did just there about welfare enhancement, redistribution, it implies a lot of things, it assumes a lot of things about the fact that when you compare utility across rich and poor people,
Yeah.
You will find it welfare enhancing in the sense that if you redistribute income, we're taking a rich person in abstract and a poor person in abstract outside of and we're not really considering the utility of the act. We're not really considering the fact that just because a dollar, like a marginal utility of $1 would be low,
Yeah.
doesn't mean that if a dollar is forcibly taken away from that person and given to another person, it would be welfare enhancing.
So you're saying it is normative? It's not strictly positive because you make the assumption that utility is good? Is that what you're saying?
Oh no, I was trying to sketch out the argument he makes against this, but yeah, that was the previous thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then he would answer back that saying, kind of, but then it's kind of obvious that the things that we want to do, we should do, or is so?
That's not coming out of, I guess, economic science.
So
That's coming out of ethics or something else.
That was the question.
Yeah.
Like if we start to make normative statements, we fall into what field?
Right.
But then,
So you have, two people, U1, X, U2 of X, right? I'm using utility because off the top of my head, I don't know how to represent it. He's saying, okay, do this, right? Adding them together, that's something, just because we assume that you and I have preferences doesn't mean we can add and compare them.
yeah.
Even if we did, economics doesn't tell us that we should do this. That's outside of economics.
right, so then that's the answer to your.
So, since I don't know if you're familiar with the notation we use, that's alright.
Yeah, I heard about it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Who is the guy who talked about the field of ignorance?
Roles.
Rose. What field is he?
Well,
Political philosophy.
social choice.
Okay.
But I think there's a normative statement hidden in there.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, I would say that there's a reason that he's doing this, knowing Robbins. But anyways.
Oh yeah, for sure, right? He has particular political preferences.
And there's a reason that this particular argument is being made in here.
Sure, but what's the normative? So you're saying it's normative because they rank references. And then you're saying it's not normative because we don't say it's good or not. We can't add them up. We can't say like we should or not. This is just how it is, and that's why the world functions as it does. And then you're saying normative because.
Well, I'm saying normative because he sets this. There's a reason why he set it up the way he has, and that's a normative credit.
Oh, so you're saying like this? It's normative because this is the example he used. He's against this
And
redistribution.
there are things that you don't like. There are states of the world that you don't like, so you construct an argument to exclude those states. I mean, that
But
doesn't mean-
like, do you agree though that this like maximizing social utility, even you assuming that this exists, that this is sort of a normative question, whether this is
No, I don't think the
or not?
statement itself is normative. I think I was arguing more about like the
It is
reason.
normative, isn't it? Because you're saying it's good.
Yeah, no, I agree.
But
I
isn't
don't
denying this also normative? Denying that this is right is also normative.
Oh no, he's just agnostic.
Yeah.
about it.
No. I mean, I could be for redistributive policy, but still realize that that's a normative statement.
But is it though? I mean, you can like surely you can construct at a formalistic level certain functions in which this was not possible. I guess if that was
Also,
if that was non-differentiable, presumably you can't max it.
You're
something,
saying
I
that
don't know.
by. So I think what you're saying
No,
is like.
if they were just discrete, which is supposed to
Right,
be
right,
two
right.
things, of course you could still max it.
But could you? I mean, I guess could you construct a way? Is there a mathematical way you can make those statements true? I guess is there a set of functions for which this statement is true, rather than just stating it in the abstract?
Sorry, could you say that again, please?
It doesn't have to be a normative statement if you have an if-then format, in the sense that like you can say if you assume X, Y, and Z, then da 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 da. But that doesn't. You're still not making a normative statement unless, of course, you say that these assumptions are correct.
So are there a bunch of statements about like facts of the world that we can make
Right.
that would allow us to deduce that we should maximize the
We
sum
shouldn't,
of
or rather, we should.
Or maybe.
the should part, whether
Yeah.
negated or not. Can we make that statement?
But he seems to be suggesting it's not that we should, it's that it's impossible for some.
From like the postulates.
Yeah,
of
yeah,
economic
but
theory.
then that's
Yeah.
like an if-then deduction, right? We accept these postulates and I've worked out it mathematically or something like that. Then I've concluded that it's impossible to do this, but that's like just a formalistic procedure. It's not.
No, I don't think it's possible.
Oh, right. So then it's not normative.
It's not normative.
So that's a positive statement.
If you phrase it as if
Maximizing social utility, let me restate. I still think maximizing social utility is a normative statement.
Yeah.
But
the question is how
it's
you
not in an
phrase it,
if-then
right?
structure. You're saying.
If you say if you want to maximize this, then the solution is x1 or this x2.
Yeah, yeah.
This is still positive because you didn't say you should maximize this.
Yeah,
You said,
and he says that like we have to,
Yeah.
we can take social preferences as given,
Yeah.
right? That's perfectly
Right.
legitimate in economic
Yeah.
theory, right?
Yep.
But we can't sort of deduce what social preferences should be from economic theory.
Yeah.
But the mere act of postulating utility functions, that's not normative? Because I think what you were trying to say is that it is normative to postulate that they can rank.
Social utility function?
No,
that
not
might be-
social, just the individual UIs. I thought that's what you were
No,
trying to say.
No, that's not normative.
That's not what I was trying. I mean, let's like. I guess this is kind of taken from Arrow and social choice. It's kind of a different way to talk about it, right? You're talking about different ways that preferences can be ranked within a voting system and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And you have with a given set of postulates, you come up with different ways that you can structure these voting systems, right?
Right.
And that may yield some normative conclusions that a political scientist might take about how this might apply to a certain, situation.
Yeah.
But that exercise in and of itself is not normative because there is an if-then structure to it.
Yeah, that's true.
But that's what I was thinking about him. But does he say should in there? I forgot.
No, he doesn't.
So then it's
I don't think he does.
I thought you said like given, let's say we have these two, let's say if I'm characterizing Robbins' argument now, if U1x postulates, then max impossible, right? Is that the structure of his argument? Did he explain? If
No, that's not the structure.
oh, but there's a should there, like
No, it's if you want to max, then you should do this. That's
Yeah.
what economics is. But we don't say we should max it. It's the if max, then do this.
Right.
That's the structure.
but is
of
that
economics.
if that's what he's saying, then he's making a positive argument. He's not making
So he does say that, and he said that that's a positive statement.
right.
Right. He's arguing against people who thinks that economics implies that there should be a max here.
Right, but that I would still call that a positive argument.
That there should be a max here. That's a positive.
Oh no, in the sense that the other people. So he's saying that the other people have a normative argument because they're.
Yes. Right.
Oh, but he himself does not have a normative argument. He's proving purely at a formalistic level that this is impossible.
He's not proving it. He's putting a normative argument such as you couldn't max it because we won't want you to our income and so on.
Right, but that's not normative, though, is it?
I think that is.
But
Because he's
Suppose
saying,
we could solve that problem. Suppose we can add mine and yours utility,
Yeah.
right?
but that's a
Why
normative
should
claim.
why should he, the policymaker, maximize it?
But
Just because
is
you can add
that? I mean, it doesn't have to be a normative claim if it's an. If the let's say you have a structure of let's say there's a way that this social choice problem is structured, right? And there are if conditions where you say this can be added, and you can put that model out there, but you're not saying anything about the normative implications we can take from that model. You're saying you're free to reject this because you reject the assumptions.
Yeah.
I would still say that's positive.
I think Robbins agrees with what you just said.
Right. Well, he's dead, so.
Agreed with what you said,
Wait,
or
so you guys
his
think
essay agrees.
You guys think
That
there's no way to add, like not through economics, but there's no way that neuroscience will find a way where we can compare your utility of eating a hot dog to his utility of eating
possibly.
Yeah, but
I
I
think
don't
it's
think that
possible.
was.
Suppose that's possible.
I think
Why
I think
should
it's
you-
possible for utility, but for preference ordinance, I think it's possible.
Well, yeah, because if you literally have a voting
No, I'm not
system,
saying-
that's an aggregation method, right? So
Doesn't the Say that again, please.
Well, I think the
I'm
problem
following.
with utility is that each utility function represents like a preference order, right? And one
Yeah.
preference order can be represented by multiple utility functions. So at the root of it, we would be comparing preference orders all the time,
Yeah.
never utility functions.
Right.
So it's even more general.
Yeah.
Right.
So the best way of doing it is preference order,
Right.
not utility functions.
Yeah. So actually, yeah, I should do that. His arguments are about preference ordering.
Yeah.
What letter do we use to represent them? I don't know.
P.
P, Q.
If you imply P is a scalar, then it's a utility function. I just thought it's interesting, like his argument that we'll never be able to, it's like logically impossible to compare your utility from a hot dog and his utility from a hot dog, but I don't think that's true. But I'm not saying anything about positive or negative.
Yeah.
I'm just saying like the fact that he said that, I was like, I don't think that's true.
But he's right though, but in the way in the way you structure the problem, if you convert it into a problem of preference ordering, then you can compare, because that's why you put P in there.